All right. Hello, everyone. Welcome. This is our final educational, we'll call it, session of the day. Brennan's kind of wrapping all of this up. We've been launching, we've been going session after session all day, just talking about all things leadership.
I think we can jump into it. This is actually a webinar, a talk that I've given on request to some other companies, some other webinars. So excited to kind of do the first one for our crew here. I think there's a shift that happens in management when you go remote, if you transition to remote. And I think that shift is really about learning to do two things. One is probably trust your team a lot more than you probably realized you were comfortable trusting. And then I think the other one is learning to be asynchronous. And I think there's a lot of tips that I'll probably drop in or drop throughout here that we can talk about. If you have questions, pop them up. And I will do my best to monitor all the various different ways you can do that. We can stop and pause. I will try to stress about if anyone wants to come up and talk with me, we can do that. But to start, I'll get it out of the way. Hi, my name is Brennan. I'm the co-founder and CEO of Hypercontext. That means I get to talk to a lot of folks who are running their teams, running their businesses, trying to scale and grow and hit goals that are otherwise thought of as impossible. And I picked up a ton of tips and learnings through that. So I'm happy to share all of those with you. I think it really comes down to a couple common challenges remote leaders face and a couple things that you can do, broad strokes, that will solve a lot of your problems. And then I can give you some, in practice tips for it. So let's start with problem number one. What are some of those common challenges? And let me know if these feel familiar to you. One is trust. Mentioned that earlier, but if you're used to managing in office, there's some element of oversight that is missing when you go remote. You no longer get to oversee your team in the same way. You no longer get to peer out of your office or over your desk and say, what are people working on? Oh, they're at their desk, they're working, or, oh, that person's in there, he's staying late, or whatever it is. You no longer see them. So what do you do, right? How do you know people are working? I think that is really, trust is maybe the problem, and it surfaces in a bunch of different ways: micromanaging, checking in, a whole bunch more meetings, all these other things that kind of come out of that. But trust is kind of the core thing. Communication. How you and the team keep each other updated and on status and progress and how you're aligned and how much you have to talk. And there's no sort of, I know that the common thing I'll hear CEOs talk about is there's no sort of water cooler effect. There's no way people can overhear things that they might need to know. There's no cocktail effect where they overhear that project they're working on and learn a little bit of extra information. And there's no way to jump into a room with a whiteboard and just quickly share all that additional context and get stuff out of the way. That can sometimes lead to problems or challenges or fears. And then rapport, right? I think probably at this point, we've all probably onboarded at least one person remotely. How do you build that rapport? How do you build that relationship? How do you build that environment where as a team, you trust each other, right? As a team, you know each other personally. As a team, you're friendly instead of strangers. And I think there's a ton of fear that, cultures that were so tight knit before become, transactional because you're no longer working with your friends. So how do you build some of those friendships over the internet, which is weird. I think the weird for a lot of people. I think the good thing is all of this is possible, right? Open source projects have almost all existed remotely. And almost every piece of tech that the world relies on right now has been built this way. So if we're able to literally run almost every single phone and Internet of Things device, using the same principles, as remote work, then it's going to be fine for your company. Same with rapport, right? A lot of people are meeting and developing relationships with people online in their personal lives, whether that's online dating or on Xbox Live playing Call of Duty with people in different countries you've never met before. You sometimes can meet some of your best buddies. And so the good news is you can do all of these things through a computer. It's just a little bit different, and it's a little bit less forgiving for some of the problems. So let's talk about 3 ways you can address these challenges and hopefully improve them. This will really just give you a framework to think through some of this. And I think once you have that framework, I think you can apply it and use it in various different ways. So to start, I've got to start with a Venn diagram. But to start, these are like the 3 core things I think you need to have across your team, whether that's manager to direct reports or direct reports, to the team or company-wide. And if you don't have these 3 things at your company, you're going to end up with a facade of a culture and then a real culture. And the facade will be cordial, probably, and the real culture will be in private channels on Slack and DMs, trying to work around some of these issues. So the good news is each of them can be solved, each of them can be fixed, each of them can have pretty easy solutions with just a little bit of self-reflection and focus. So let's jump into each of them. One is safety, and that's a particular type of safety called psychological safety. Usually most of us are pretty safe at home behind a computer. So the type of safety we're thinking about is psychological safety. Second one is effort to communicate. We want that to be super, super low. And the third is the benefit of doing that. And as a manager, I think the specific things that you want is having your employees coming to you, right? Instead of you coming to them. I think this is the most important kind of concept of remote work. You don't want to necessarily be bugging people all the time. What's this? What's that? What's happening? And so if you can make it really easy for them to come to you, you're going to make your job much easier. And once you see this happen in practice, you're going to start developing a little bit more trust that if there is something, I'm going to hear about it. So the first, psychological safety. Let's think about like, what is this, right? And so the more traditional definition is, do people feel comfortable sharing their thoughts, their feedback with you, with me? Is there a level of fear that's preventing open communication? This is one that is tough because it's hard to know if you have it. It's hard to test if you have it, but it's the first and most immediate blocker. You can imagine, I think it's probably easier to imagine this in high school or university when you're doing a group project in high school or university, when no one feels comfortable initially proposing a project or proposing a thought. Everyone is kind of waiting for the other person to kick off that conversation. Everyone's a little bit shy, even though they're probably not shy people. In kindergarten, you have the opposite effect. You have people who have extremely high psychological safety because their brains just aren't developed enough to get social fears yet, right? So they can run around at the playground and talk about the weirdest things or the silliest things or the craziest things or random ideas, and they'll all propose like, oh, I have a better game we can play. Let's jump up and down as fast as we can. And it's so silly, but they don't care. They'll shoot it out there and just want to have fun and play games. And sometimes other kids will be like, no, I don't want to play that game, and just shut them down so cold. And it doesn't bother those kids. Like, okay, let's play a different game then. And it turns out that in the workplace, that type of environment produces significantly better results. In fact, there's been multiple studies on this. So I'll give you 2 examples. And they actually pitted kindergartners against MBAs, and the kindergartners won. And the task was, you're given marshmallows and spaghetti, build the tallest tower. You have 20 minutes, go. The kindergartners just started doing it. And the MBAs were trying not to step on each other's toes, They were proposing ideas or solutions or trying to explain some law of physics about, the most structurally secure thing. And eventually, they only had about, 5 minutes to actually build it. And so when they started building it, they discovered a whole bunch of new things and ended up with some suboptimal first attempt that they had to submit to the researchers. The kindergartners literally ran out of spaghetti and marshmallows. They had built like 15 different towers each. And they looked over at what the other kids were doing. And when they saw something was working with the other kid, they stole and implemented in their design. And they eventually ended up with one that was really, really good. And obviously the kindergartners win. That study you can repeat basically in any country, and you'll find that the kindergartners win all the time. The same thing can actually can happen with adults. This isn't like something that just gets beaten out of you. You can take MBAs, split them up into two groups, and give them two separate tasks. One task is build the best vase or vase out of clay that you possibly can. But group A is only allowed to build one, and group B has to build as many as they possibly can. And each of them are obviously allowed to submit their absolute best vase, but the second group is told to make as many as they possibly can. The question, the scientists were trying to ask is which group will produce the best product, the best end result in that 30 minutes time. And the obvious answer there, without a doubt, is the one that is producing as many as possible, partially because they can throw out all the errors, but mostly because no one knows how to build pottery in an MBA group. And so they learn, and the faster you learn, the faster you fix mistakes and implement things that work and are able to iterate towards a more perfect product. And I think in most people's workplaces, certainly in the information age, there isn't an answer to anything. There is no perfect way to build a vase or vase in our workplace. It's only building a better version of the thing we're currently doing. The only way you can do that is by iterating. So I think that the answer to some of these things is how do you create an environment that's a little bit more like kindergartners, where everyone's experiencing something for the first time and no one's shy and no one's sheepish and no one's scared of being put down, and a little bit less like MBAs or a little bit less like high schoolers. I think the high school example is probably more intimate for everybody, but there's cliques in high schools and there's ways of dressing in high school. And there are things you can say and things you can't say, all the way to, if you're following along, like, the kids today have to do side parts and what I think of as mom jeans, like otherwise it's not cool. And just the fact that there's almost like fashion police for real in high school is hilarious to me, but is a reality for people going to high school. Similarly, those things happen in the workplace. And if you don't feel safe wearing clothes that make you feel comfortable, but instead have to feel safe or, have to wear clothes that are approved, you're probably not going to feel comfortable challenging the status quo with your thoughts. If you can't, physically do some of those things. So step one is you want really, really high psychological safety. And Google found that teams with the highest degrees of psychological safety significantly outperform teams with lower degrees of psychological safety. So how do you actually create this? Because every team's unique. And I think the answer is you're going to want to lead by example here. The quick hack is lead by example. And that's going to be you as the leader feeling comfortable asking the dumb question, being the stupid one in front of the crowd, suggesting wild ideas, bringing up crazy topics. And if you can do that, if you can kind of put yourself out there and demonstrate it's okay, to say these random things and bring up random thoughts, and that no one's going to be dunked on for having something that's out of line, then you can start training and building this habit that, hey, in this place, it's weird, but in this place, we're pretty comfortable with being challenged. We, in fact, expect it. We want it. So that's step one, psychological safety. Make that high on your team. That's hard to do remote. I'll give you some tips here in a second. The second thing is effort. As a manager, you want to make sure that you're a low effort person to communicate to. Otherwise, people will just not communicate to you. I've had examples in the past where people will not communicate to their manager and communicate to me simply because that manager was high effort. The way they described it to me was they felt like anytime they had to bring this person feedback, either about themselves or about a process or about a thing that they were doing, a task that they were asked to do, it felt like they had to defend their PhD dissertation. I've never had to defend a PhD dissertation, but I imagine that's a lot of work. I also know that this individual never had to do it either. So they were kind of being a little extreme there. But the point here with effort is how much energy does it take for a person to have to share feedback with you or go out of their way to give you information that otherwise you might not know or agree with. And I think as a manager, particularly remotely, you're going to want to make sure that you're a very low effort individual to share feedback to, otherwise you won't get it. This is like scientifically described as the iceberg of ignorance. Basically, leaders only know about 90%, or sorry, about 10% of the problems that exist on their team. And that's largely because 90% of the problems aren't being shared with them for reasons like this. So you're going to want to make sure that your team is sharing with you, but understand there's limit. I'll give you some tips on how to decrease effort and make effort really, really low. There's some Jedi mind tricks, I think, that make this helpful that are just kind of picked up over the years. But really low effort, that people are willing to share feedback with you. It's very easy to do it. They're not going to feel like they have to drink a cup of coffee, maybe do some push-ups before they jump on a video call with you. If you're watching any of the remote TikTok videos right now, you'll see tons and tons of examples of employees who are like, being very pleasant with their boss, hanging up that Zoom call or that Teams call or that Google Meet, taking off their headphones and screaming into a pillow. You couldn't do that in office. People are literally doing that in remote. And so you want to make sure that, that's not your team. And if you think it's not your team, or you think it, there's probably about a 20% chance someone on your team is doing that with you. So you want to be really, really low effort. And that'll allow people to kind of relax a little bit in the informational flow. I'll show you, I'll tell you a little bit more how to do that. Sorry, these are jumping around on me. Okay. Third thing in that Venn diagram, benefit. And you want benefit to be very, very high. So when a direct report shares something with you, there has to be benefit, whether that's feedback about you, whether that's feedback about the team, whether that's feedback about a process. If there's no benefit for them going through all of this effort to inform you, to advise you, to come up with solutions, to waste their time even, and stress, they're just going to stop doing it. So whether they're giving you feedback about yourself, whether they're giving feedback about the company, you're going to want to make sure that when they do share, when they do kind of open up, when they do share feedback, when they go through that effort, they become vulnerable for a second and share their opinion. Do they feel like it's worth it? Back when you were allowed to go to coffee shops, in Canada anyways, during the workday, sometimes I would work out of a coffee shop and you would overhear conversations from other people, from colleagues who were working together, or people who were meeting for a lunch, work lunch. And inevitably one of them would start complaining. This person does this, and this person does this, and this is stupid, and this is bad, and this is inefficient. All these things suck at my workplace. And inevitably the one person would say, well, have you brought that up with your boss? And without a doubt, every single time the person would say, what's the point? They don't listen anyways. And I think that's what we're trying to get at here with benefit. You want to make sure that your team behind, your back at a coffee shop is not saying, what's the point? They don't listen anyways. And so you almost want to have in your mind an undeniably perfect record that every time someone comes to you, there's a benefit. They're being listened, they're being heard. And for most people, they probably think that's true. For most new managers, they probably think that's true to begin with. I think for most experienced managers, they're often not agreeing with the feedback that's being shared, or not implementing the process that's being requested, but they're still making sure the other side knows that there's benefit to sharing. So I'll give you a couple tips on how to do that as well. But if that all makes sense, let me just go back to this. those are like the three core things I think you need in order to enable a high trust environment where people communicate with you, particularly the hard or the awkward things. And an environment like this builds great rapport. It makes it really easy to share. So this is kind of like the microcosm of a culture that you want with your direct reports. So with those three things, that's super nebulous. That's super, I don't know, I would call this like university speak or like whatever, PhD speak. Like, how do I actually do this in practice tomorrow when I, am talking to some of my teams? So there's a couple things, and then I'll give you a tip. So the first is that you're going to want to make sure you're doing one-on-ones. This gives people a safe place to bring things to you privately. I would recommend, and there's a whole bunch of studies on it, but I would recommend weekly meeting with your direct reports. If you're doing more creative style work, if you're doing very process-driven factory style work, you probably get away with 2 weeks. Some people do monthly. Depends on the topic of conversation. But if you are talking about work in a one-on-one meeting, you probably want to do it weekly. And the reason why you want it weekly is twofold. The first is you want this meeting to become your employees' meeting, that they can bring things to you. And in fact, that they're expected to bring things to you. And this is like a good way to batch up all of their quick questions and thoughts and feedback that isn't necessarily urgent into one meeting. And so you can kind of get, in 30 minutes, you can get a whole bunch of stuff communicated and done. I think the other part that a lot of people don't realize is communication is a part of people's job. And this is a really good opportunity to start building that muscle. They can communicate some of the more, higher level stuff about their work in these meetings, or about their plans, or about their actions, or about their fears. But the big thing here is this gives a safe place for you to give feedback and for them to give feedback. It's a private meeting that doesn't have to be called, right? If something goes wrong, if you need to give tough feedback, you don't have to book a meeting on their calendar and say quick chat. You can just add it to the agenda and know on Friday or Monday or Wednesday when you meet with that person, you're going to talk to them and you can bring it up. In that meeting, I think you want to make sure you're creating this environment here. In at least that one meeting, you have a very perfect track record on all of these accounts. That's probably priority number one. Some best practices for those meetings: make it recurring. I would arguably make it the same time, same day of the week, same time, so that there's a little bit of consistency there. I would, the subtle change here, the tip is always never cancel or reschedule. You'll probably hear that a lot. I think it's okay to reschedule. I think it's okay to cancel. People go on vacations, things happen. The real thing to hold yourself to is, can both people rely on this meeting occurring? And too often they get canceled and rescheduled because both sides don't think they're necessarily important. However, when you talk to execs, when you talk to VPs, they think they're the most important meeting of their week. And so if you're in the camp of people that think these meetings aren't super important, yet every executive at more or less every tech company is saying they're the most important meetings they do, I would think about why. Why are you canceling and they seem like they can't? But number one thing is you want to make sure they're reliable. And if they're reliable, people will rely on them. And then you can start to use them for these purposes. I would go on video every time. I think it's just helpful to have some of the more rapport building conversations. What's in the background, have a conversation about that. I would push that the direct report owns and runs the meeting. They're the one who sets the agenda. They're the one who takes the notes. I think that's much easier on the manager. I think it trains the direct report to manage up. And I think it puts all of the onus on coming up with an agenda every single week on the other person. That means, though, that you have to come prepared, right? So you have to read that agenda ahead of time. You have to take notes, that you have to commit to things, that they're going to assign you next steps and you're going to have to follow up with it. Status updates you can probably just do on Slack or email. Don't do them in that meeting. And the second thing would be vulnerable. As much as we don't want to admit it, managers are the ones with power in that relationship. And so it's hard for the folks with less power to be vulnerable to the folks with power. It can be used against them. I think the easiest thing you can do to start creating some psychological safety is be vulnerable and open up first. I'll go back to this chart here really quickly. My quick tips, because I think this is really important for one-on-ones, my quick tips for safety, effort, and benefit in that room. Safety, be vulnerable first, right? If you want someone to open up about, how at-home life is affecting them at work, you probably need to bring up how at-home life is affecting you at least 5 times, not in the same meeting, right? Over multiple times, in order for them to feel like, all right, this might be an okay topic to talk about here. It's still going to be really hard for them to do. Effort, the quick tip to make effort really, really low is never, don't interrogate, I guess. Typically when we're receiving feedback or receiving hard to digest news, we're going to start asking a whole bunch of questions. The Jedi mind trick is don't ask questions, reflect what they say. And then the question you use is like, am I getting that right? They'll give you all the info. So if they're saying, Brennan, you're talking over someone, or Brennan, you're late to the meeting, don't say what meeting. I mean, that might be helpful for you to know so that you can contextualize that feedback and decide if you want to agree with it. But I think the first thing you want to do is say, okay, so let me reflect this back, make sure I'm understanding it correctly. The feedback that you're giving me is that I'm showing up late for meetings. And what you might hear is like, they might say, yeah, or they might say, no, it's not about you being late. It's like you're on time. It's just that when you're on time, you're not present. You're doing email for the first 15 minutes. And that's frustrating the team. And you go, oh, okay. And after you do a couple of those reflections and then just reflect back, okay, so the meeting is on time, but the meeting is on time, but I'm not present at the start of the meeting. So the meeting is delaying because of me, blah, 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 blah. And reflecting that back will start to lower the people's guards. They won't feel like they have to fight you to get this feedback heard. They'll feel like they're being heard. Just the fact that you're reflecting it will make them feel heard, make them feel understood, and they'll self-clarify your own reflections. And the most surprising thing that I learned when I started putting this into practice is just how often it's in it, like an absolutely alarmingly high rate, just how often I am absolutely wrong. I am mishearing things. Sometimes when you get feedback you don't want to hear that cuts really, really deep, it's like a grenade goes off in your ear and you just hear like the pinging, right? And you kind of go silent. And you got the adrenaline rush of like, uh-oh. And the reflection, just lean on the reflection crunch. What I'm hearing is this, what I'm hearing is this, until you get it right. And then you can start to layer in some of the other questions. So it would be effort. That's like the easy way to make effort low. Benefit high. My only tip here is you don't have to agree with every single piece of feedback you get. What you do have to do is make sure that people understand there's a benefit of giving you feedback, even if you disagree. And so the easiest way to do that is to say, hey, listen, thank you for this feedback. What I'm going to commit to you right now doing is like sitting on this for a bit, running for a week, seeing if I can encounter myself doing this, or see if I can witness some of this stuff myself. And what I'm going to commit to you right now is by next week, I'm going to come back to you with my thoughts. I'm going to digest it. I'm going to let it sit and settle. I'm going to see if I can data collect myself, whether it's talking to other team members who maybe experienced the same thing or not. And then I'm going to come back to you and we're going to talk about, we're going to close the loop. And that itself is benefit. The fact that they've been heard, listened to, understood, that you've explored that concept, and then you've come back to them and you said, hey, listen, I disagree, but I disagree for these reasons. That's benefit. A lot of people don't think that that's benefit. And a lot of times what happens is people will go on, will basically ghost the feedback. And they'll say, okay, I'm doing email and meetings. And then they disagree with that and they never change their behavior. And eventually over time, people will say, what's the point? They never listen to me anyways. So those are a couple of those tips. Team meetings also super important. I think the key thing you want to make sure with team meetings is that the team collectively owns the meeting. Otherwise, privately, they're going to complain on Twitter that it could have been an email. So how do you get rid of that? Make sure the agenda is collaborative, right? Make sure that it's not just the stuff that you want to talk about. It's not just the stuff that you need to check in on, but that each person is responsible for bringing something up. I do this in some cases in my personal life too, with some folks I consider mentors, where we are all responsible for one agenda item. We have to bring one, and it's mandatory that we bring one. That's important, and we just rank the importance of that agenda item when it comes time for that topic. So when we get there, we do this ranking 1, 2, 3 out of 5. 5 means it's burning. We have to talk about it immediately. And anything below 0, or sorry, anything below 3 means you didn't try hard enough to come up with a good topic to discuss as a team. So we do that as a group. We talk about the 5s first, the 4s second. We usually don't get to the 3s, but we bully the people who chose 3. Set the expectations with your team that you expect them to do things like that it's not your meeting, but it's our meeting. And so part of being our meeting is each of you have roles. And so whether that's someone is in charge of taking notes or watching the clock or bringing agenda items, make sure you set those expectations. Assign action items, hold people accountable. People will stop complaining about it potentially being an email thread once you start doing that. Encourage recognition. You can recognize people over email, but it means a lot more on video if someone says, I just want to pause for a moment and just say this person did a really good job. It means a lot to me that you did a good job and you did a really good job. That is not going to happen over email with the same effect. And the final thing I'll say here is take feedback after every meeting, right? Just like the pottery, you're not going to have a perfect meeting on your first go. It's about trying to have a perfect meeting on every single go. And learning what made it good and what made it bad and iterating towards something that's a little bit more perfect. If you're not taking feedback at the end of every single meeting with your team, or at least listening for it when it's being said, you're not going to get close to having a perfect meeting. It's a little bit like building a product and never asking your customers for feedback or never opening up your support queue. It's never going to happen. And in a lot of ways, as managers, as leaders, the product that we create are these managerial moments, is alignment, is buy-in, is commitment, is excitement, is motivation, right? Is good strategy. And a lot of that is going to come from listening to feedback. We have a ton of templates on our website, built into our app as well. If you want some of these ideas that I've just been spouting off, you didn't have time to scribble them down, you can do that. Lastly, I'll say have clearly assigned and defined goals. 90% of what you say in a meeting is going to be forgotten in 7 days. So if you're talking about something that's very important, reminders to the team, this is our quarterly goal. It's really important. In 7 days, your team will only remember 10% of what you said. So having clearly defined goals that are easily memorable is part one. Part two is making sure that you communicate with your team every single time you talk to them about what those most important things are. If you're telling your team that these 3 things are the most important things you're going to do all quarter and you never bring them up again, you're subtly telling your team they're not that important. Otherwise, it'd be the only thing you talk about. And instead, what you end up talking about is the urgent things, and you're subtly telling your team that the urgent things are more important than the important things. That's the default pattern we have. If you flip that script and talk about the important first, then you're going to have much higher success of actually hitting your goals. And then beyond that, I think what you also want to communicate is how those goals ladder up to the company-wide goals. So that people feel buy-in towards those goals, that you're actually collaborating with them on those goals. You're not just giving it to them. You're asking them what goals would work. How do you see us solving this problem that I've been given? Do you have solutions and goals and strategies and tactics that could work? And let's come up with some of these goals together. Tons of benefits, whether it's OKRs, SMART goals, MBOs, it doesn't really matter. Just the idea of having a goal that the team has solves a whole bunch of problems. Aligning the team, giving them ownership, giving individuals a sense of purpose, and honestly, like making employee evals easier. The one tip I would give to, it's my dog, employees in a remote environment is in office, we've been trained to be lazy with coming up with goals. And I think when we're remote, the key thing is to think about the difference between an outcome-based goal and an output-based goal. In office, there's kind of this office culture sometimes can work relatively well with output-based goals, like presence over performance, right? People showing up at 9 and working really hard to 5, or people sending a lot of emails. And I think what happens when you have output-based goals and then go remote is managers will often say, well, I can't see people working, so I don't know if we're working towards our goals, because we've been trained to measure the output. And I think what you want to get to is measuring the outcome that you're looking for. So it might not be about the team working really hard. It might be about the team achieving the outcomes you want, whether that's a conversion rate. And that itself can be the goal. Give your team the conversion rate. That's really what you want. Give that to your team and measure the outcome, the progress towards the outcome, not necessarily the work that's required that you're dictating. Output goals will force your team to achieve tasks, and outcome goals will allow your team a little bit more autonomy in how they achieve that outcome. And I think with remote, it's really important to think about outcome versus output, because that will allow you to relax a little bit and know whether or not my team is showing up at 8:30. We're measuring the outcomes that we need, and they can work at 7 p.m. at night for all I care, as long as we get the outcomes we need. So I think it's an important thing to maybe Google around a little bit and double check and see if your goals are there. We have the largest library of goal examples on the internet on our website. So if you need some inspiration for basically any role in tech, it's on our site. I think it's hypercontext.com/goal examples. A little bit about us. If some of that seemed like a lot of words and maybe hard to remember, we are Hypercontext. We've built most of what I said into one single workflow that allows you to tie those meetings you have into the objectives that you have and into the morale that you need on your team in one workflow. It's an app on the web, it's on your phone, and it's also integrated into tools like Microsoft Teams and Google Calendar, so your team doesn't have to go to another place, or you don't have to go to another place. You can open up Google Calendar and basically do everything I said and kind of achieve those same goals. So that's a little bit about us. With all that out of the way, I'll bounce it to questions. I'll bounce it to the chat. If anyone has thoughts, if anyone wants to jump up and start chatting, happy to chat live as well.
Thanks, Brennan. That was awesome. I think I feel like a broken record because I echo and repeat so much of that Venn diagram in everything that I do, because it's just so succinct. It just makes it so much easier to be able, because there's like 100 best practices, if not more, that you can apply to one-on-ones, to management, to like everything that you do. But I think breaking it down to just those 3 things makes it really easy for you to also stay focused, just like you want your remote team to stay focused on goals. Helps you stay focused on being a good manager.
Yeah, I think it's definitely probably the hardest aspect to be a good manager on, because the other part of your role, the other half of your role, is codified probably at this point in a tool, right?
Yeah.
So if you're a sales manager, the other half of your role, the performance, like are we getting closer towards our sales goals, is going to be in Salesforce. If you're an engineer, manager, it's going to be in GitHub or Jira or Linear, because we're just moving over to Linear. And so you kind of know, right? Like, hey, the quality of this code, is it good? The quality of these things, like you're going through code reviews. If you're a customer success person, you have a customer success tool, right? And so managing success tasks and success playbooks is going to be in your success tool. But if you think about managing your people, you think about managing the relationship, you think about managing the rapport, or your ability to get those people motivated, and the ability to learn from those people who are going through that process. You're not going to do that to manage a salesperson on Salesforce makes sense up until the point you get to person, right? The salesperson's a human first, not a sales opportunity. Same thing with an engineer. That doesn't make sense to manage an engineer on GitHub. Makes sense to manage your code on GitHub, or your project on GitHub, but I think you got to manage the person as a person. And I think they're much more than an avatar behind some of these project management tools that we've invented. And so, yeah, the other half of your role, I think, can be somehow broken down to, at least on the receiving end of it as a manager, into those 3 categories. I think the other part about this is, as a manager, how do you force your team? How do you force an individual who's high effort to become lower effort? How do you force an individual on your team who doesn't foster psychological safety to start fostering it? But one half of being a good manager is making sure that you're adjusting on the fly to other people's styles. And I think this gives you a framework to say, at least if nothing else, the feedback channel that's fully within my control is thought through and working. And whether or not people are listening to my feedback is a different thing, right? And that's a different thing that you have to coach. But at least the one that's within your control has a little bit of a framework to help guide some of your thoughts and understandings.
Yeah. So I'll just iterate. There is a Q&A. If anyone wants to ask their questions there, you could type it in chat. But while you're doing that, if anyone has any questions, safe space, we'll say. I'll kick it off with another question for you, Brennan. What is one thing that people listening who are either managers, aspiring managers, senior managers, whatever they are, what's one thing they should do tomorrow to better manage their remote team? One actionable thing, let's say.
Outside of like get our app and use it?
Yeah, get our app. It's on Product Hunt, which you can see. But beyond getting an app to facilitate better meetings.
For better meetings,
or just better remote management in general.
I think there's a few things. I think the first thing you can do, I think it's going to be honestly, there's going to be a whole bunch of tips in here, but I think it depends. So that's the answer. It depends. Depends what type of employees you're dealing with. If you're dealing with employees who are doing deep thought work, so developers or designers or folks who need to spend unbroken amounts of time working to get a task done, I think my tip is this tip of maker schedule versus manager schedule. And the reality is you're going to be on manager schedule, and that means you're interrupted all the time. And in fact, part of that is your role. You're going to have meetings throughout the day that are happening at random hours. And you're going to have gaps in between your meetings of an hour, 20 minutes, and maybe you can get a little task done here. That's not a big deal. That's the manager schedule, a lot of meetings. And meetings, in fact, are kind of a big part of your job. For folks who are working on tasks, meetings aren't a part of their job. And if they tend to view meetings as an unproductive activity, and it takes a while for managers to kind of undo that self-learning that we all do. And the reason I think they detest them so much is because meetings interrupt their flow. So a lot of people get into, what's sometimes called flow, sometimes called focus time, where they're able to sit down and just work for 4 hours. If you put a 15-minute meeting in the right smack in the middle of that focus time, that for a lot of roles destroys an entire afternoon. So as simple as it can sound, right? Your 15-minute quick check meeting, the dread of having that meeting will destroy productivity for that person for 2 hours beforehand, because they know, oh, maybe I won't start this big hairy project or this big hairy problem because I don't know if I can finish it in 2 hours. And when I have a 15-minute meeting with my boss, I'm going to get so distracted that it's going to take me another 20, 30 minutes to get back into the task. And then I probably won't get it done by the end of the day. So I'm just going to do smaller things that aren't as hairy and nebulous. And then come the end of the week, it's like, I didn't get time to do that. I was kind of, jumbled around in meetings, whatever, even though it was only maybe an hour meeting. So I would think about, as a manager, if you're a first time manager, being very, very deliberate with the times you choose for your direct reports, if they work, if they don't meet as work. And so there are times that are going to be really productive to have a meeting for them. And that's going to be after they have a natural break, right? Natural breaks happen after you eat food, or natural breaks happen, at the start of a day, like you're starting a day, you're not working. So the first thing I would do is know that off the top of your hand. Like when do people start their day typically? When do people have their food typically? And then I know I can kind of book time, and that's not going to be destructive to their schedule. If you don't know what that is off the top of your head, that's an item you add on your one-on-one. Hey, when's the most productive time for us to have a quick chat in any given day, right? When do you start work? When do you go for lunch? When do you have a walk around the block? Those things used to be in offices, very visible. Like I would know people who I'd never worked with, because I would see them walk past me in the morning. Like, oh, that person typically shows up around 10 or typically shows up around 8:30. Now it's invisible. And so I think you want to know when is a good time to have a distracting meeting, like a one-on-one. And if you do that in the right moments, you're going to get disproportionately more value out of those meetings, because the person isn't distracted by that hairy thought that they don't want to lose. So I would think about batching your meetings with people onto one day, so that your engineers only meet Friday mornings or Mondays, and then they have 3 days completely void of meetings, versus splitting up all of your meetings across certain different times. I think that's maybe one tip for remote managers is, as much as your schedule is the most busy schedule when you look at calendars, their schedule is probably the one you have to respect the most, because you can cause these butterfly effects into their work, their focus modes and workflows that destroy productivity. So if you can batch all of that to one day and leave everything else as sacred, you're going to get way more happiness out of your team. And of course, be available for your team whenever they need you.
Yeah, I think you sent me a maker versus manager piece within the first week of me being a manager, and it's stuck because I completely agree. You don't want to, when you're an individual contributor, the last thing you want to do is context switch, especially when you're deep into a specific type of work. I know, with engineering, you have flows. With writing on the marketing side, you have flows that you get into, and that takes time. It's not just like an instant thing that comes.
And context switching is a huge part of your job as a leader, as a manager. In fact, you're expected to context switch all day. Probably why you've been promoted to that role, right? That you can jump around to various different people and talk to various different groups and give them the information that they need, the context that they need. And that context switching is good. For people who need 4 hours of focus on one piece of context at a time, switching context can destroy what they're doing. It doesn't actually destroy it. It takes them 20 minutes to get, on average, it takes them 20 minutes to get back into task. But that 20 minutes requires discretionary effort. And discretionary effort is kind of the PhD term for engagement. And engagement is kind of the university term for trying. So they have to try hard for 20 minutes to get back to the state they were prior to you interrupting them. And when it's 2 p.m. on a Thursday, people won't try hard. Most people won't, because they're tired.
And it adds up.
Yeah.
All right. Bye, everyone. Thank you so much for joining. Thank you, Brennan, for an awesome presentation as usual. Cool.
See you soon.
Okay. Bye. Hi there. The session you just watched was part of a day-long leadership summit where we had over 23 leaders share their expert advice on what leaders can do today with their team, from remote management to one-on-one meetings. To check out the rest of the sessions, you can click the link here for the full playlist. You can also subscribe to our channel, as we'll continue posting all things leadership. And you can also visit our website at hypercontext.com. Thanks.